Hey everybody, this is Russ from RetroGamecore. Today we're going to review this device here. It is called the TrimUI Smart. Like with the previous model made by TrimUI called the Model S, this is a very small handheld console. And the focus here is going to be on portability and ease of use. And along the way, they've made some pretty decent upgrades to the hardware on this device. For example, this is the first small device I've ever tested that has both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth included. And so in this video, we'll do a quick unboxing and then go through the navigation experience when it comes to the stock operating system. And then of course, we'll test to see how it performs as a gaming machine. And before we begin, I'll give you a quick rundown. This device is really well made and it actually is a lot of fun to use. But there are some software limitations that prevent it from reaching its full potential. That being said, I think a community supported software solution, something like Onion OS on the Miyoo Mini, would be incredible on this machine. And so without any further delay, let's take a deeper look. Okay, let's take a quick look at these stats. Now this is running an Allwinner S3, which is a dual-core ARM CPU clocked at 1.5 GHz. And this processor is usually used in things like industrial applications. And as a result, like with the Miyoo Mini, it does not have a graphics chip. But as you'll see later in the video, the performance is about on par with the Miyoo Mini itself, so you can play up to PS1. It does have some internal storage, but unfortunately is not accessible to the end user. And the display is 2.4 inches with a 4:3 aspect ratio and a resolution of 320 by 240. The stats on the website say that it has a 1000 mAh battery, but if you open it up, the battery pack itself is actually 1200. And I would expect around 3 hours of gameplay on average. And like I mentioned in the introduction, this one has 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi and also has Bluetooth. And we'll test both of those here later on. Now mine is a review unit sent to me from KeepRetro.com. They currently have these for sale for $80 as the starting price. And as you can see, it comes with 4 different colors, and I actually think the purple one is the best. I don't know why, but it just looks nice and distinct. Okay, quick unboxing here. I've always found that the TrimUI boxes are much better than their competitors. And as you can see, they're promoting the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. They also mention a TrimUI market, but there's no indication of that in the software. It does come with a basic user manual just to help you kind of get through the menus, but they are pretty intuitive. Other than that, the only other thing it comes with is a USB-C charging cable. First impressions of the handheld itself, I like the feel of the plastic here. It's a little bit smooth and a tiny bit grippy. In fact, it reminds me the most of the feel of a Nintendo Switch Lite. Second observation here is that the device is kind of loud. It has a pretty distinct rattle. Let me turn up the volume for you here. And unfortunately, the rattle comes from both the shoulder buttons as well as these menu buttons on the bottom. Let's talk about the D-pad first. This has a soft texture to it, almost like it's rubbery. But honestly, I like it. It is nice and grippy. The D-pad itself has dome switch connections, so it's soft and clicky. And while it doesn't have a lot of travel, it doesn't really matter. It clicks down really nice and quickly. This makes me feel like it has a very accurate input. And as we'll see later, it works really well when it comes to fighting games. The face buttons are very similar, also dome switches and soft clicky. Not a lot of travel here, but they do have that same soft texture. Overall, I like these buttons. They remind me a bit of the Nintendo Switch or even something like the Retroid Pocket 3. While I do think using a rubber conductive connection here would have made it feel a little bit more old school, I actually think this is a smart move right here because it makes the buttons not stick out as much, and as a result, it makes the device a lot more pocketable. Now below the screen, we have the select, menu, and start buttons, and for some reason here, these ones are exceptionally clicky. So yeah, unfortunately, these 3 buttons are very rattly and also loud. Up top, we have the power switch, which toggles on and off, and then the shoulder buttons. Now, depending on where you press on the button, it is going to input differently. For example, on the edges, it is very hard to press down on it, but near the center of the device, it is super easy. But honestly, I think that makes sense because you're going to spend more time wrapping your fingers around these shoulder buttons, and so you're not really going to be pressing it at the edges anyway. Now, unfortunately, this does not have L2 or R2 buttons, and that would have been necessary for some PlayStation 1 titles. And so that is kind of a bummer and something you'll have to work around depending on the PS1 game you want to play. But other than that, no complaints about the shoulder buttons here. On the bottom, we have a USB-C charging port that can also be used as a data connection, for example, if you wanted to use an adapter with headphones. And then on the other side, we have our microSD card slot. Now, mine came with a 32GB card filled with games. And all the testing I'm going to do in this video is going to be with these stock games. Now let's take a look at the screen. Like I mentioned, this is 2.4 inches altogether, 4:3 aspect ratio. And there are no visible bezels. Basically, they covered it up with the rest of the plastic shell. That does mean the screen is a little bit indented here, and so it might collect dust here on the edges. On the left side here, we have the option to add a lanyard if we'd like. On the back, we have some small plastic feet and then the TrimUI logo. You may notice there are no screws here. You just have to open this up by prying open the plastic case. But yeah, other than that, a very simple design. As you can see, there are no volume buttons at all. You have to adjust the volume using hotkeys. So now let's compare it in size to some other smaller handhelds. We'll start with the most popular one of the year, which is the Miyoo Mini version 2. Now this one has a 2.8-inch screen, and those 0.4 inches make a really big difference. Even though the Miyoo Mini itself is much smaller than the TrimUI Smart, in fact it's about the size of a pack of playing cards, it feels like a much larger device thanks to the screen-to-device ratio. Let's try comparing with another 2.8-inch device. This is the Anbernic RG280V. Now this one's a little bit shorter and squatter than the Miyoo Mini, and as a result, it just does feel a little bit larger than the TrimUI Smart. Of course, this one also has a very large screen-to-device ratio, which makes it more impressive to hold. And honestly, it's kind of hard to compare vertical handhelds against other horizontal handhelds, so let's move over to some horizontals next. So this one here is the previous TrimUI model. It's called the Model S. This one actually has a 2-inch screen, and while the screen size looks about the same, that's because the Model S had some really big bezels on it, as you can see here. We'll do some screen comparisons when it's actually on here later in the video so you can see the difference. And to be honest, I was never a huge fan of the Model S, and most of that had to do with the small size of the screen. 2 inches to me was just too small. I did appreciate that the device was well made and impressively tiny, and after custom firmware was introduced for the device, it got even better. But long story short, I didn't actually use it that much, and it all had to do with the screen. And so my hope here is the slightly larger screen on the Smart device is going to win me over. Next, let's try the Anbernic RG280M. So same size screen as the 280V, but in a horizontal form factor. Now there are quite a few things I like about the 280M. It has an analog stick as well as larger sized D-pad and face buttons. And so while it is a relatively small device, it did feel nice and chunky. That being said, I didn't like the fact that it was metal. It made it very heavy, and it was a little thicker than I would have liked as well. So I think if they had ever released a plastic version, I would have liked it a lot more. Now the Powcutie Q20 is actually very similar to the device here. It has the same size screen and about the same size altogether. That being said, it runs an older chip and older software, and so the performance is not really there. This thing struggles to play most Super Nintendo games, and PS1 games are mostly out of the question. Now another device here is the Powcutie Q36 Mini. I don't think this is a very good comparison because it only has a 1.5-inch screen, and the aspect ratio is 1:1, which makes it not ideal for most systems. And so this one I would consider to be a bit more of a novelty than an actual genuine portable handheld. And so yes, I think just in terms of size and portability, this is kind of a winner. My only major complaint when it comes to the hardware are the menu buttons and the rattling that comes from them, and the fact that this screen seems kind of small for the size of the device itself. We have other smaller devices like the Miyoo Mini, which is so impressive in its screen-to-body ratio. The TrimUI Smart, by comparison, feels like it has more wasted space. Okay, let's take a look at the stock operating system. Now this is flashed onto the internal storage, so there is no easy way to change this out. But as you can see, it has a very simple menu system, which we'll go over here in a second. First thing to notice is the background music right here. This is the same music that was on the TrimUI Model S, and yeah, it is super annoying. What's worse is if you go into the settings and turn off the background music, it'll only work while you're in those settings. As soon as you come back to the menu from a game or from powering off the device, it's going to come right back at full volume. I've also seen some versions of this device floating around that have the ability to change themes, which can then turn off the music. So hopefully this is something they can fix in a future update. As it stands right now, it is super annoying. Anyway, first thing I tested was the Wi-Fi functionality, and yes, it can scan for a Wi-Fi address. It found my network and I was able to connect no problem. However, the only thing you can really do with the Wi-Fi is play against other players, and obviously I only have one of these units, so I'm not able to test that. Before I forget, let me talk a little bit about the hotkeys. So if you press the select button and then press L and R, it'll adjust the volume. And if you do the same but with the start button, it's going to adjust the brightness. And this will work no matter what game you're playing. Those are the quick hotkeys for that. Now I decided to also test some Bluetooth using my AirPods. And the first time I tried it actually worked out really well. It connected first time, and the audio immediately started coming through the headphones. Now when I tried to record the audio here, I was trying to test for audio latency, and I'll let you hear a sample of it right now. Now I wanted to re-record this footage, but putting the earphones closer to the mic on my camera so we could get some better audio. But unfortunately, the second time I tried to pair the Bluetooth headphones to the device, it would not work. Instead, the menu would get stuck right here and nothing I could do could actually fix it. So unfortunately, other than that first time when I got Bluetooth working, I never got it working again. In fact, I had to manually power off the device just to get back to the rest of the menu. Now I did some other Wi-Fi testing. Here I am in the RetroArch menu and I'm trying to find the Retro Achievements section. Unfortunately, the version of RetroArch that they're using does not have that as an option. I even went into the config files on the SD card and tried to manually add some Retro Achievements options. None of it worked. So this is one of those places where if we had community developed software that had a better version of RetroArch, we might be able to use this as a Retro Achievement machine. But as it stands right now, it's unfortunately not a possibility. But I will say that the online function within RetroArch does work. For example, if you go into the online updater, you can do things like update your installed cores, or you can even download new emulators from the core downloader option. So theoretically, you could add additional systems and cores to this and get them working. So now let's quickly go through the front menu. There is an activities section here and it just says the word scanning. I think this has to do with NetPlay for later. There is a playlist section. It's just going to show your recently played games. But the main place you're going to spend your time is in the retro games section. This is going to show you all of the different emulators that came stock with the device, and so you can just select your system, then navigate through the games and start them up. Now to add a game to your favorites, you would just hover over the game and then press the menu button and then select Add Favorites. Then when you go back to the favorites menu, you'll see it there. Now, while in a game, you have quite a few options. For example, if you press the menu button, you can do a save state or load state. You can also adjust the volume or enter the advanced menu, which is where you would get into RetroArch. And within here, you can do all the typical things you would want to do within RetroArch, like adjusting the video settings and things like that. A couple other observations before we get into gameplay. When you plug the device in while powered on, the white light does get a little bit orange, but there is no indication in the menu that it is actually charging. However, if you plug it in while powered off, it will turn orange like this and then turn off when it's done. Now this is the screen at the very lowest brightness, so let's go ahead and turn off my studio lights so you can see what it's like playing in a dark environment. And so the screen brightness isn't bad. I would say it's a little brighter than I would have liked, but the big thing here is that huge flashlight that's coming from the front of the device. And I gotta say, this white light is super distracting in low light or dark scenarios. You can kind of cover it with your hands, but as soon as you move your hand, it's gonna be like a blinding beam right into your eyeballs. Other than that, not a lot of light bleed all around, but it is a shame. I think that if you really wanted to play this in the dark, you would need to open this up and then cover up that light. I'm just not really sure why they thought having such a bright light on this device would be a good idea. Okay, I'm going to kind of bounce around between the different systems that I talk about performance because I want to show off some other demonstrations. To start, I'll say that Super Nintendo emulation is pretty good from a speed standpoint. I played quite a few minutes of Yoshi's Island and did not detect any slowdown at all. However, this is running an older version of the Super Nintendo core, and so because of that, the audio is not very good. And so unfortunately, the Super Nintendo emulation, despite being pretty fast, is not very accurate. Now by default, most every single game is going to be stretched out to the full 4:3 display, and that is going to cause some scaling issues like you can see here with the life bar in Mega Man X. Now we can go into the RetroArch settings and change it to integer scaling instead, and that will fix those scaling issues, but it will make the image much smaller as well. And with a 2.4-inch screen, you need every millimeter of real estate, and so unfortunately, while it looks much better at the integer scaling like this, I honestly think that most people are going to prefer playing it at the full screen 4:3. This does make the image quite muddy by comparison, and it really can't hold a candle to something with a 640x480 display like on the Mii U Mini. And this problem is not just for Super Nintendo, the same thing will happen with your Nintendo games too. Here's Mega Man 2, same issue here with the life bar. If we switch it over to integer scaling, we're going to get that same 8:7 aspect ratio, but yeah, it's going to look a lot better. So of course, it's going to be up to you whether or not you want to make a small screen even smaller to have a nice sharp picture, or whether or not you're willing to live with that larger muddied scaling. Now one thing I do recommend doing is go into the advanced settings here, then back out to the main menu, then go into settings and then saving. Within here, turn in the autosave and autoload options. After that, you don't have to do anything else. You can just back out into the game. And then when you exit out any game from here on out, it'll actually save where you are and then go back to that save game. Let's test it out here with a Game Boy Color game. And as you can see, yes, I'm closing it out. And then as soon as I open it back up, it's going to go right back to that same section. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, this is using the MGBA RetroArt core instead of the typical Gambate core. And unfortunately, this core does not have colorization options for the original Game Boy. And so you're going to be stuck playing Game Boy games in black and white, as you can see here. I did try manually loading the Gambate core, but unfortunately it crashed. Now, Game Boy and Game Boy Color are two systems you probably do not want to do integer scaling with. As you can see right here, they look really small. And so unfortunately with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, there's not really a great solution when it comes to nice scaling. Most Game Boy Advance games seem to work pretty well. This is using non-integer scaling here, so unbalanced pixels, but it still looks pretty good. Now, not every single Game Boy Advance game is going to play at full speed. For example, here is Final Fantasy VI Advance, and it's hovering around 52, maybe 51 frames per second. So while I would say most Game Boy Advance games will be just fine, not every single one of them will. And I forgot to record it while doing this first footage, but here's what it looks like with integer scaling on. As you can see here, it is also quite small. So for this one too, I would recommend doing non-integer scaling. Here's Sega Genesis. This one actually performs really well and looks good. In fact, I would say this one looks a little bit better than Super Nintendo, even with the non-integer scaling. And so as far as being a portable Sega Genesis machine, yeah, it works out pretty well. PS1 performance is about where I would expect it to be, so 2D games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, they actually work really well. You should expect to get a solid 60 frames per second for most of these types of games. However, if you try to play some more intensive 3D games like Bloody Roar 2, unfortunately this one cannot play at full speed. I would expect to get about 48 to 50 frames per second on some of these harder to run PS1 games. But it should be pretty good for role-playing games and things like that. Now, surprisingly, the systems I had the most fun with when it came to testing were the arcade games. Despite not having an analog stick, I actually had a really great time playing a lot of beat-em-ups on this system. I don't know why, but I just really marveled at having a very small, pocketable little arcade machine. And when it comes to fighting games, as I suspected, the controls on this are on point. In fact, this is one of my favorite D-pads when it comes to playing fighting games. The shallow travel and the soft clickiness of the D-pad coupled with the pretty good pivot make it really exceptional when it comes to very precise input. And so I think if you're looking for a pocket fighting game machine all the way up through CPS 3, this is going to work out really well. And so I think, believe it or not, of all the systems I would want to play on the TrimUI Smart, it's the arcade games that I think are going to be the best. Okay, so digging a little bit deeper here, let's actually insert the SD card into our computer and take a look inside. And honestly, the configuration here is very similar to other systems I've seen. You'll have a ROMs folder that'll have different systems within here, and then within each of these, you can add all of your games. As you can see, they're using zip files for the ROM, so this will support having compressed files. Within each of the ROM systems folders, you will find a core folder, and within there, you will find different save states. So it should be relatively easy to move your save games back and forth between devices. Now, a couple other tricks I figured out. If you go into the emus section here, it'll have different folders for each of the emulators. And if you go through here and add a period in front of those folders, what that will do is it'll hide it from the main menu. So if there are some systems you don't plan on playing on this device and you don't want to see them in the menu, this is the easiest way to do that. It's not going to delete any of the files, but it is going to make them hidden so you don't have to deal with them. Also, within each of these emulation folders, there's a configuration file. If you open this up with a text editor, you can do things like change out the naming convention. So for example, instead of having FC for your NES games, you can have them changed to say NES. Additionally, within each of these folders is an icon file. You can change these out to change out the icons if you'd like as well. And unfortunately, unless you really want to get into the weeds, that's about it when it comes to customization. You can hide some of the systems, you can change out the names, and then also adjust the icons. And so after about an hour of playing around with the SD card, this is what my system now looks like. If I go into the retro games section, you can see I have new icons, and I've also changed out the naming to match the North American naming conventions. And of course, I've also trimmed down the playlist to just the systems I plan on playing the most. In addition, I took out all of those ROMs that were with the stock operating system and then added my own. And so now I have a slightly optimized version of the stock operating system. I've changed out the names and the icons, and I have my own games inside. And so in that regard, I do think this device is pretty close to being a pick-up-and-play solution. It's very easy to curate the ROMs list, and honestly, the menus are not that hard to navigate either. And so I think as a beginner's handheld, this isn't a terrible choice. Okay, so now that we're done with testing, let's go ahead and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the TrimUI Smart. To start, I think the device has an overall nice look and feel. I wish the screen to body ratio was a little bit better, but overall, I don't really have any complaints about how it looks. I really like the soft clicky buttons, especially when it comes to the D-pad. They are very nice and precise. On top of that, the buttons do not stick out far from the case, which makes it very pocketable. While I don't think the stock operating system is terrible, it does have a lot of potential. If a community project like Onion OS decided to work on this device, I think we would see something a lot better than what we're seeing now. For example, the Wi-Fi is working here, it just doesn't really have a lot of function. And sadly, while there is Bluetooth, I couldn't get it to work after that first time around. So hopefully firmware updates from TrimUI or Community Solutions can fix these things down the line. It's really going to come down to how popular this device becomes. And finally, among the things I like about the device, it is relatively easy to add games or make small tweaks to it as well. There's no need to flash an operating system to an SD card or any of the other things that you would expect from, say, an Anbernic device. So now let's talk about some of the things I don't like about the TrimUI Smart. Number one, those menu buttons that are below the screen are super loud and they are also very rattly. In fact, overall, this device rattles more than 90% of the devices that I typically will test on this channel. I sincerely hope that they are able to fix the background music bug right now because it is a quality of life thing that is completely annoying. It's like the worst elevator music in the world and you just can't get rid of it. I was also disheartened to find that there were no retro achievements available within the version of RetroArch that we have on this device. Honestly, this would have been a huge selling factor for me because I love retro achievements and it would have been cool to have it in a tiny little device like this. The image scaling was also something that bothered me because a lot of the games, especially Nintendo and Super Nintendo games, looked kind of muddied. While I don't think it's the end of the world for a lot of users, and definitely not for a small device like this, it is still kind of a bummer for something at an $80 price point. And then finally, that bright LED light was also something that affected my quality of life with the device itself. As it stands right now, this is 100% a device I would not want to play in the dark. So yeah, overall, that's what I think about the TrimUI Smart. There are a lot of things going for this device, but there are quite a few things that bother me about it as well. At the end of the day, I really want to love this device. I was really hoping that it would be a nice horizontal alternative to the Miyoo Mini. And unlike the Miyoo Mini, this one's pretty easy to find. There are several stores selling it right now, whereas the Miyoo Mini continues to be sold out almost everywhere. And so within the context of this device on its own, in a vacuum, these are the things that I think it would need to have in order to be much better than it is. Number one, I think that if you plan on playing this device in the dark, you are going to need to expect to open this up and cover up that LED light within the case. Number two, I think the main draw of this device that sets it apart from the others is the ability to use Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Unfortunately, unless we see some significant firmware updates from TrimUI or a community-based solution, something like Onion OS, we may not actually see that full potential. And so while this would be a really nice small little retro achievement handheld, it's really going to come down to whether or not the community decides to support this or if TrimUI is able to add additional firmware updates. At the end of the day, in comparison to the previous model that TrimUI released, which is the Model S here, I do think the TrimUI Smart is better in almost every single way. Yes, it's a little bit larger and thicker, but the screen is bigger, the buttons feel a little bit better, and if we can get some consistent Wi-Fi and Bluetooth features, it's going to be pretty awesome. The major difference to me is that a 2.4-inch screen is just big enough to be playable. I found that for the most part, the Model S would collect dust, but I think the TrimUI Smart, especially if it gets tweaked to perfection, might be something I would play often. However, when it comes to small devices, I still think the Miyoo Mini is much better overall. Not only is it cheaper, but it's also quite a bit smaller and has a larger screen and has some wonderful community software to support it along the way. Of course, the major drawback of the Miyoo Mini is its availability. It basically requires you to check the Miyoo AliExpress website almost every day to see if one's going to be in stock. So while I'd love to say, well, just buy a Miyoo Mini, you'll be much happier, unfortunately, that's not quite the case. Now, that being said, Miyoo is working on a horizontal device, and I think it's going to have the same screen size as the Miyoo Mini. And so I'm really hoping that that one will take the cake as being the best small horizontal handheld available. So when it comes down to it, here are my recommendations. If you are a little bit impatient and you want to have a small retro handheld in a horizontal form factor, right now the TrimUI Smart is the best one to get. However, if you don't mind waiting a little bit, I would recommend just taking a step back for a month or two and to see whether or not you're going to see community software in the future, or if TrimUI is going to update their own firmware, or if Miyoo actually releases their horizontal handheld. So yes, I do think the TrimUI Smart is a pretty nice device, but I do think it is priced a little bit higher than it should be, and there are quite a lot of software bugs that give me some hesitation as well. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this a device you're considering, or are you going to wait and see? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.